haven't read, you can pick up today in our book sale. It's called Congress Shall Make No Law Respecting an Establishment of Religion, Why the Religious Right is Wrong. And he will be signing these afterwards. He's also got a new book coming out next year, tentatively titled Taking Liberties, the Right Wing's Attempt to Redefine Religious Liberty and What It Means for You. And when I talked to him about it, he was explaining to me it's kind of like why the Catholic bishops are just screwed up. I think it'll take more than one book, but he's going to give it his best effort. So I went online last night to try and dig up some dirt on Rob Boston because he's one of the nicest, decent people I've ever met, and I thought there's got to be something. And even with Bing and Google and Yahoo, I couldn't find anything. But I did manage to find out a few things, and the reason I did is because he's so good at digging up dirt on the religious right. I thought that fair is fair, right? He loves The Simpsons. He hates sports. If he could be anything except what he's doing now, he would be an interpretive park ranger at the Grand Canyon, just so he could lecture everyone about what really happened there. And he once went on a hunt for Bigfoot in western Pennsylvania. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Rob Boston.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you all for coming. Good morning. And the answer is no, we did not find Bigfoot. We looked real hard, though, and had a good time. I want to talk to you a little bit this morning about a couple of things. Things about humanism, things about separation of church and state, a little bit about where we stand right now, what we may need to be doing in the future, how things might shake out. I want to begin by just, a lot of you aren't going to be able to see this, but Amanda mentioned the work I do, tracking the religious right, and going to their meetings and monitoring their materials and their websites and so on. A couple years ago, I was at a meeting, and this group, the American Family Association, had a table there, and they were passing out copies of their magazine. And the magazine is called the AFA Journal, and the headline is, Secularism, Can It Be Stopped? And this is like a giant steamroller, in case you can't see that. Big old steamroller, that's secularism, you know, it's just gonna get your mom, okay? You're gonna get it. That's really how they view it. I mean, we look at secularism as a platform upon which religious and philosophical freedom rests. That without an official government policy of secularism and a secular government, you just don't have the freedom. But they look at it as a very dangerous and threatening thing. And that's why they portray it as a steamroller. Why do they feel this way? Why do they believe this way? Well, the religious right, folks who make this up, have the belief essentially that their members, they themselves, a band of believers, are the only ones to correctly interpret a holy text that is thousands of years old, and that this text speaks to every aspect of modern life. And that belief that an ancient text addresses all aspects of modern life leads us to some very strange places. I have been in meetings of the religious right where I've heard people seriously argue that the Bible speaks on issues like gun control, the capital gains tax, bootstrap capitalism, they're for it. Jesus was for it. International relations. Pat Robertson once said that the United States is only mentioned once in the Bible. And the interesting thing about these opinions that they hold is that they always seem to dovetail with the extreme right-wing position. Isn't that convenient? That the holy book that they look to as the sort of platform and the guide for society always matches up with their political beliefs. Now we have been experiencing and seeing some changes in American society lately, and there's been a lot of talk about what this means and what kind of a country we're going to be in the years to come. A couple of things that I want to touch on. A lot of people have talked about the rise of the nuns. And no, I'm not talking about the women who work in the parochial schools. Okay, I went to Catholic school for 8 years. I have my experience with those. I'm talking about the N-O-N-E-S, the nuns, who now account for, according to some polls, about 20% of the American population. At the same time, there's been this rise of people who call themselves spiritual but not necessarily religious. And that is a term that sometimes grates on humanists. They look at it as a little bit squishy and maybe a little bit new agey, but I would recommend and I would ask you to really kind of lay off of those folks if you can, because the religious right doesn't like them either. When I go to the meetings, I hear the religious right say a lot of things about humanists and atheists and non-believers. I hear them say a lot of nasty things about liberal Christians, and I hear them say a lot of things about the people who claim to be spiritual but not religious. So, in a sense, if you look at the doctrine of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, we can probably build some bridges to these folks and work with them if we can. We've also had a poll recently that showed something that was fairly remarkable. For the first time ever in American history, the number of Protestants has dipped below 50%. And when you think about that, for a nation that was sort of a WASP tradition for many years, to the extent that that term became a joke or a cliche, the Protestant work ethic, terms like that, going through the popular culture, that's a pretty remarkable thing. It shows how our nation has changed, increasing numbers of non-Christians, and at the same time, these religious trends have probably had political fallout as well. We have seen, for example, greater acceptance of LGBT issues and increasing numbers of people saying that they are supporting same-sex marriage, marriage equality. And in the younger generation, most people think that this is not even going to be a serious issue for them because the support is so high. Now, I was born and raised in western Pennsylvania. And those of you who know anything about Pennsylvania may remember James Carville's famous comment that it's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Mississippi in the middle. Well, I'm from the Mississippi part, and I saw a headline that really shocked me before I came out here for this conference, that for the first time ever, a majority of voters in Pennsylvania, 54%, say they support marriage equality. So we're seeing, even in a state that, while it trends blue in presidential elections, has a pretty conservative social streak in it, yet we are seeing this change. There's been a talk, even among the Republican Party leaders, that maybe they've gone too far. Maybe it's time to de-emphasize some of the social issues and look at some of the economic things instead. But before we get too cocky, let me just remind you of a few things. Groups affiliated with the Tea Party movement are estimated to control state legislatures in about 24 states. The House is under far-right control, and they are plotting to get a hold of the Senate in the interim elections. Groups like the Family Research Council, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the American Family Association, rake in collectively almost $1 billion every year. When you add in those groups and some of the prominent television evangelists in this country, it is a huge amount of money, a lot of which is plowed directly into political efforts. So before we think that we've kind of nailed this down and we've settled everything, we need to think about a few things, a few challenges. And I just want to outline those right now for you. First thing we need to think about is this new effort by the religious right and their ultra-conservative allies to redefine religious liberty. This is going to be the issue for our times. Remember in the 1980s, all you heard coming out of the religious right constantly were family values. You heard that term constantly. Family values. Whatever they wanted to do, they would justify under the phrase family values. Well, religious freedom is the new family values for the right wing. Think about what they're trying to do with this. The right to determine whether or not we can get birth control from our employers. And that's religious freedom. Well, the employer has an objection to it, so the employer doesn't have to provide it. The right to ignore laws that they don't like to protect gays and lesbians. Well, I have a religious freedom objection to that. I don't have to abide by that law. Even people arguing that they don't have to open their businesses to people whose lifestyles they disagree with, even though we have something in this country called public accommodation laws that require you to open your business to everyone. We have people arguing that they have the right to make public prayers before government meetings, that that's religious freedom, the right to pray in the name of the entire community. And as some of you may know, Americans United has a case pending before the Supreme Court now that will test the boundaries of prayer before government meetings. So that argument, that discussion, that debate is going to be extremely important to us, because we are seeing a number of cases right now in the courts that test this boundary of what religious freedom really means. Does it really mean the right of an employer to say because I personally oppose birth control, which some of these employers are saying, I can deny it to all of my employees, even if my business has nothing to do with religion, even if it's a manufacturing concern or a retail establishment. There's a chain of stores in this country called Hobby Lobby, and they sell crafts and art kits, things like that. They have 22,000 employees. Well, the owner of that company opposes contraceptives, so he's trying to deny it to all of his employees. Nothing they do is religious, yet he's trying to go into court and argue with that. That's going to be the first challenge. The second challenge is the struggle for a real pluralism that includes all of us and is undermined by a real government neutrality. For a long time in this country, we've had what I would call kind of a fake government neutrality. The Supreme Court technically says, oh yes, we're supposed to be neutral on religion. The government is supposed to be neutral on religion. But the government is anything but neutral. If the government were neutral on religion, we wouldn't have religious graffiti on our coins and on our money. If the government were neutral on religion, we wouldn't have to go into court to fight things like prayer before city council and county council meetings. We wouldn't have a Pledge of Allegiance that requires us to make a religious affirmation as a condition of expressing our patriotism. The government is anything but neutral on religion. What are we working toward? Well, we're working toward real, absolute neutrality. When the government takes a stand on something that seems even to many people benign, like in God we trust, I hear that one all the time from folks. Oh, what's the big deal? It's just a generic affirmation of God. But think about it for a minute. The phrase means that the government's position is that there is a God, one God, that this God, he, she, it, exists, that we can benefit somehow from trusting in this God. That trusting in this God is a good thing to do, that positive things will flow from our decision to trust this God. That is not neutrality. That is the government taking sides on a theological issue, and they have no business. Aside from that question, we have the challenge of real pluralism and real diversity that includes all Americans. For a long time, many of us have kind of felt a little bit outside of the great American experiment because we have no God belief and no belief in the supernatural. Thomas Jefferson spoke of the desire of the multiplicity of sects, believing that there would be a lot of different denominations in the country, a lot of different religious organizations, and that they would provide kind of a natural check on one another, keeping any one group from getting too large and too powerful. And Jefferson's vision would have included non-believers because he spoke about that sort of thing. But for a long time, too many people have felt outside the American experiment because they did not have a traditional belief in God. So that's a long-range goal when I talk about real neutrality. It's not something that the Supreme Court is going to embrace right now as it's currently constituted. But it is a long-term goal, one that we need to be working on. And that leads me to the third challenge, and that is the struggle for the courts. The courts are the body that are going to decide just about all these issues that I'm talking about today. Whether it's prayers before a government meeting, the proper role of religion in public education, the limits of religious liberty, whether it does include the kind of broad definition that the religious right is struggling for, those are all going to be headed to the courts. In fact, there are dozens of cases right now in the federal courts dealing with this question of religious freedom and how far it is to be interpreted. And we have seen at the Supreme Court level many 5-4 decisions. Now, this is something that requires a political solution and will have to be resolved through political organizations. Some organizations are not appropriate to do this type of work. The American Humanist Association is a 501c3 organization. The Americans United is a 501c3. We cannot endorse or oppose candidates for public office. But there are organizations and there are entities that can do that. And remember this as well. Most cases in the federal court system never reach the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court hears about 1.8% of all the cases that are appealed to it in a given year. 1.8%. That means that the vast majority of those cases are being decided by the lower courts, lower federal courts. Remember how men and women end up on the federal court bench. They are nominated by the president. The Senate has an up and down vote, yes or no. The House plays no role in the matter at all. So, when you're picking a president, when you're picking senators, you are also, in a sense, electing federal judges. Be aware of that. They're very important to this process. In 1971, the Supreme Court came up with a test in a case called Lemon v. Kurtzman. Alton Lemon who brought the challenge, aided by the American Civil Liberties Union, died recently. Mr. Lemon was a very important figure in history, church day history, who tends to get overlooked a little bit. The Lemon test basically states that a law violates separation of church and state if any one of three prongs are violated. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV. But I want to read to you these prongs. First prong, the law lacks a valid secular purpose. Prong 2, the primary effect of the law is to advance or inhibit religion. Prong 3, the law fosters excessive entanglement between church and state. Under the Lemon test, if any one of those prongs is violated, the law must be struck down. The problem is that the Supreme Court has done great violence to the Lemon test since 1971, and right now it's on a type of judicial life support. It did not have to be this way. What would our federal courts look like right now if we had not had 8 years of George W. Bush in the White House? Believe me, they would look a lot different. We are in many ways a 21st century nation saddled with a 19th century Supreme Court. We cannot advance the way we need to advance, and we must advance with a Supreme Court that is stuck 2 centuries ago. That's the third challenge. The fourth challenge is the struggle for science. And here I don't just mean creationism, although that is one of the major issues of our day. There's a larger philosophical discussion underway among the religious right. I hear it, I see it when I go to their meetings. To them, science isn't a superior way of knowledge. It's just another way of looking at the world. And of course, their faith-based way of looking at the world is equally valid, and in some respects to them, even better. And it doesn't matter what evidence you have, or what amount of evidence you have, they will continue to look at things through that lens. Now, over the years, especially with creationism, we've had various formations of this. They have changed the name so many times. They started out calling it creation science in the early 80s when Louisiana tried to pass a law mandating that it be taught alongside evolution. Then they changed the name to simply creationism. Then, and one of my favorite name changes, for a while they were calling it the theory of abrupt appearance. Then, of course, intelligent design. And now, the new stunt is critical thinking. See, they're really doing us a favor when they bring this stuff into our schools. They're trying to teach our children critical thinking. And they often will expand it and say, well, it's not just creationism or evolution. We want there to be critical thinking about global warming and human cloning and other issues. But this really isn't, of course, doing anybody any favors. It's the same old biblical fundamentalism, masquerading as science, trying to sneak in through the back door of the public school. Now, I would say this to you. People often ask me, what can we do? The public school system in this country is very decentralized. There's no national curriculum, and there's a lot of local control. Well, the first thing you need to do, and I speak as someone who has put 2 children through the public school system, look at the books that your children are using in their biology classes. Find out what's in there. What's the treatment like? Because the creationists, although they haven't been very successful in court, what they have managed to do is create a climate of fear and intimidation to the point where many textbook publishers are afraid. They won't give evolution the treatment it deserves. Some don't even use the phrase. Imagine that. The central underlying concept of modern biological science, and they don't even mention the word. So look at those books, and be aware that you may need to challenge if the treatment is not good, or augment your children's education if it's not being done in the right way. I mean, we can go into court and win these cases. Americans United was involved in a situation in Dover, challenging intelligent design a few years ago, along with the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Center for Science Education and some law firms that helped us with that. And that was a really wonderful thing to win that case. We all felt good about it. But courts can only take us so far if we don't also keep an eye on what's going on actually in the classroom. That's the fourth challenge. The fifth challenge is the struggle to recapture and regain our history. There is a kind of a religious right alternative to American history that has become very popular in those circles. And I hear it and I see it a lot when I'm at these meetings. Now, you would think that this would not be a particularly difficult thing for people to grasp. The Constitution is a secular document. It doesn't contain any references to Jesus Christ or Christianity or God even. It is a secular document. And you know, it's available to people, the Constitution. I hear it's even on the internet. So you can read this thing. Yet, we still find huge numbers of people telling pollsters that they believe the Constitution gives some special recognition to the Christian faith, when it's not in there. And of course we have Article 6. Article 6 is a provision in the federal Constitution that bans religious tests for public office. Now why is that in there? Well, because there used to be religious tests for public office. Some of the colonies, they used to have a provision that said you couldn't hold public office unless you were a Christian or even a Protestant, or my favorite, you had to believe in a future state of rewards and punishments, heaven and hell, or you couldn't hold public office. It was a way of restricting office, keeping non-believers and sometimes Jews and other non-Christians from holding office. At the federal level, it was decided that that simply was not going to be tolerated, that there would not be any provision like that, that there would be a provision that would say instead that there's no religious qualifications. Now, wouldn't it be an odd thing for a so-called Christian nation, which is what a lot of Americans believe we have officially, a Christian nation, to put a provision in its Constitution stating explicitly that federal office is open to all folks, regardless of what they believe or don't believe about religion? As a matter of fact, if you look back at the history of this situation, you will find that the religious right is not hearkening back to the founding period. The founding period is the time of men like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and John Leland, the fiery Baptist cleric, who has the unique distinction of helping disestablish religion in 3 states. He worked with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to do it in Virginia. Then he went back to his native Massachusetts and did it there. And while living in Massachusetts, conducted raids across the border in Connecticut and helped people do it there as well, to end state-established religion. So you had that spirit, that sentiment. That's the founding sentiment. Cut the tie between church and state. Religion and government must be separated. The state does not need the proper religion and vice versa. That's the sentiment of the founding period. Where does this idea of the Christian nation come from? Why is it there? Why do we have it? Well, I will tell you, it is a largely post-Civil War, late 19th century phenomenon that occurred as a direct result of that conflict. A little history. The early years of the Civil War, some of you might remember, weren't going very well for the North. The North was kind of cocky and was thinking, well, we're going to win this thing. It's going to be quick. It'll be, we've got the bigger army. We've got the industrial might for this. But they lost several of the early battles. Some people began to panic. There was a minister in Pennsylvania who became convinced that the reason that the North was losing the war was that they had offended God in some way, and that God was punishing the nation with this poor performance in the war. The way to get back into God's good favor, this minister felt, was to somehow recognize God officially. So he wrote to the Secretary of the Treasurer, Salmon Chase, and he suggested that a phrase be placed on our coins: God is our trust. Now Chase liked the idea, but he tinkered with it a little bit, tweaked it. He changed it to, in God we trust. And that began to appear first on a 2-cent piece during the Civil War that was issued in the northern states. But that wasn't enough. Seeing that victory and being sort of getting that win led some of these ministers to think, well, what else can we do? How else can we change this nation? So they began to advocate for a bunch of other things. They advocated for strict censorship laws, that they could control what people were seeing, what people were reading, even what was performed on stage. Some of you who know about the history of free thought are aware that in the late 19th century, it was difficult for free thought publications to be put out through the U.S. mail, that they were often suppressed and censored. That was because of pressure from these ministers. They were considered obscene. The same laws that were used to ban the mail of obscene material was applied to free thought publications. They advocated for strict Sunday closing laws. And we still have a remnant of those today. In many parts of the country, commerce is curtailed, or certain types of businesses are not open and others are. They advocated for that, and for a long time they were very successful in shutting down a lot of businesses on what they considered to be the Lord's Day. They advocated for mandatory Protestant forms of worship in the growing public school system. Public education in the United States is largely a post-Civil War phenomenon. The idea that the masses should be educated, that there should be a public school system, that's late 19th century. Prior to that, there really weren't a lot of public schools. And as that system rose up and became more prominent, these ministers, who formed a group called the National Reform Association, another type of NRA, advocated for these things. And they advocated for official prayer in schools, recitation of the Lord's Prayer, and reading of verses from the King James Version of the Bible without comment. Many states adopted laws like that. Of course, they were later struck down by the Supreme Court. In fact, this year, 2013, is the 50th anniversary of Abington Township versus Shemp, which is one of the prominent school prayer decisions in this country, and its companion case, Murray v. Curlett. So if you are interested in finding out more about that, I have an article that I can point you to that was in our magazine, Church and State. The last thing they advocated for, this group advocated for, was an official Christian nation amendment to the Constitution. They would have rewritten the preamble to explicitly include references to Jesus Christ, Christianity, and state that that was the official religion of the nation. Now, this preamble, this Christian nation amendment, was introduced in Congress several times in the late 19th century. Never received a full vote in Congress, although there was one vote before a House committee that voted it down. But it continued to be introduced as late as the 1960s. So if you look back at this sort of history, this discussion of the Christian nation, what you're seeing is not something that goes back to the founding period, but comes from a very different time in our history. Remember, the late 19th century was a very tumultuous time. When the Civil War ended, you had this great period of social upheaval and an attempt to move the nation forward in a way that would be, most people felt, would be positive. But of course we know it didn't quite work out so well. There was a lot of violence, a lot of suppression of rights. In a state like that, at a period like that, at a time like that, a lot of people are naturally going to gravitate toward more conservative forms of religion as a way of dealing with the social dislocation that is occurring. That's the genesis of the Christian nation myth in the United States. It's not from the founding period. It's from the late 19th century. It is an aberration. It was sometimes flirted with by our courts and our legal system during that period, but it did not have staying power. The sixth challenge for us is the challenge of culture. And this is one I want to talk a little bit about because it's very important. The question of culture at the religious right meetings I attend is discussed all the time because the question of culture fundamentally asks, what kind of nation are we going to be? And the religious right has a vision for that nation. They have a vision that would exclude millions of Americans. They have a vision that would relegate many of us to second-class citizenship. We have a much different vision. And people look at some of the things that are going on right now and say, well, we're gaining ground, they are losing. And maybe there's some truth to that, but remember this. It's always important to ask ourselves, what lies beneath that vision and what motivates it and what pushes it forward for the religious right? We thought some of these things were settled. We thought that we had finally nailed down that people have the right to use birth control. The Supreme Court kind of settled that issue in the Griswold case back in the 1960s, and people would have thought, okay, that's done, that's taken care of. Many of us were surprised when the Roman Catholic bishops, aided and abetted by the mainly Protestant religious right, came on with such ferocity when they had the chance to begin to attack people's access to birth control. Well, what lies beneath that? What motivates that? What pushes that forward? And we have to realize that these groups are still smarting from a cultural revolution that brought about so many changes in American society. And one of them was affordable, safe contraceptives. Now, I can't stress enough how profoundly that changed American society. There are people in this room who lived through it, who remember it, and who could talk about it probably in a lot more eloquence and detail than I could. Think back to how things used to be, and not this country, but worldwide, before women had the power to control their reproductive decisions. That ability of the church to make those decisions for families, for women and for families, kept them in power for literally thousands of years. Because the power to control a woman's reproductive life is the power to control women. The church knew that. So for so long, they fought this. For something like 1900 years. They lost that. And they lost it even among their own members and supporters. The Catholic Church right now, if you look at the polling data, something like 96 or 97% of members of the church say that they use some type of artificial contraceptives. They can't even persuade their own members. And just as they've lost that, let's look at some of the other things that they've lost. Well, I talked a moment ago about the control they had over public education for many years, how conservative religious organizations had their prayers in the schools, their interpretation, their reading of the Bible in the schools. They've lost that. They've lost the right to punish people for what consenting adults do sexually. For a long time, they had that power too. They had the power to, if not punish gays and lesbians outright, certainly terrify them to the point where they remained closeted. They had the ability to control what we saw, what we read, what we were exposed to through films, plays, novels. You know, sometimes people will joke about something being banned in Boston. Why do they joke that way? Well, because they used to ban things in Boston. We think about Boston now as this cosmopolitan, northeastern liberal city. But for a long time, that city was under the thumb of the Roman Catholic bishops. And if they didn't like a book, or they didn't like a magazine, or they didn't like a stage play, one phone call to the relevant authorities would put a stop to it. It took people like us, who believe in freedom of expression, who believe in the free exchange of ideas, going to court to fight and put an end to that. So they lost that too. So look at all of this consider all of this stuff that they've lost. That stings. That hurts. Having the power to control people's lives almost entirely and having it stripped away from you one by one. And it has made a lot of people angry, and it has made a lot of people hateful. Now, the religious right meetings I go to, one of the things that strikes me is exactly that. So much anger, so much hate. Why? Why? People will brag at these meetings. Brag about how they have disowned their own children because they're gay or they've joined a different religious group. They will go ballistic over the decision of the Boy Scouts to allow gays in that institution, to the extent that they will say they're going to start other types of organizations. They will say, without shame, and say it proudly, that they would rather see a child who has no parents in institutional care than be adopted by a same-sex couple who would love that child. They say these things. And they say them proudly and boldly and openly. And I sit there and I listen and I think, what sort of strange parallel world have I wandered into? They say these things, they mean these things. What can possibly explain this anger, this rage, this hate? Well, it's anger over all they have lost and the fear and almost the certainty that they are going to lose more. There's a cultural evolution underway, and no court ruling, no legislature, no law can save them in the long run. And deep inside themselves, they know that. I mentioned that poll in Pennsylvania just a few moments ago, and we're seeing that replicated in a number of other states as well. And what has really startled me is the pace of the change. I started working at Americans United for separation of church and state in 1987. I was 24 years old. So it's been 25 years. And at that time, if someone had told me in 1987 that in my lifetime I would live to see a number of states legalize same-sex marriage, well, I would have scoffed. Nobody in the gay rights movement that I knew back then was even working toward marriage equality. They were looking at more things like anti-discrimination legislation and increasing tolerance generally. The social change began to accelerate. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be tension and there's not going to be skirmishes when this comes to fruition, however it does. And it will come to fruition. I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to say. We know we're going to get some rulings about this issue in a couple of weeks. I was at the Supreme Court in the press gallery for both arguments on Proposition 8 and DOMA. As I mentioned, I'm not a lawyer. My feeling is that there's probably not 5 votes on the court to extend marriage equality nationwide. This is not a court that dreams big. This is a small thinking court. They probably will strike down DOMA. But Proposition 8 will have to wait for another day. But that day will come. Now, we're going to have to do a mop-up operation in the South, but we always do. Some of the more conservative areas, absolutely. But things like this are only causing these religious right activists that I visit so often to react with more fear and more anger. And I hear the assertion constantly from these organizations that God's judgment is nigh. This time we've gone too far. God's had enough. And they start to sort of connect the dots in really strange ways. Well, you know, there was that really bad tornado. There was that hurricane. I really want to know what Oklahoma did that really torqued off God so much. And this is the state that actually changed its state constitution to ban Islamic law. Because, you know, Islamic law was a real threat in Oklahoma. Less than 0.5% of the state of Oklahoma is Muslim, so they were clearly right on the verge of taking over the state. And if you go down to the courthouses in Oklahoma, of course you'll see huge monuments to the Koran. Oh wait, no, not the Koran. You see the Ten Commandments. So Oklahoma does have a problem with religious law, but it's not quite the religious law that some of those people thought it was. But they start connecting the dots, you know, natural disasters. Pat Robertson is an amazing person to be able to do this. Everything that happens, somehow he manages to twist that around to be the hand of God. But you know what? They've been threatening us with that one for, 2,000 years? God's judgment is nigh. He's coming back any day now. You're going to be sorry. It's a bit of an empty threat. And they know that. Deep inside themselves, some of them know that. The religious right, the Catholic bishops, very angry over their losses, but that does not mean they are not dangerous. Far from it. Just like a cornered animal, they are quite capable of lashing out and inflicting great damage on our body politic. And that's why, as I wrap up, I want to leave you with a couple of tasks. First thing I want to do is actually read you a little passage from a novel I read recently. Eca de Queiroz is a Portuguese novelist who wrote it in the 19th century. One of his most famous books is called The Mayas. It deals with a family whose last name was Maya. In one passage of this book, an old man is raising his grandson because the boy's parents are dead. And he discusses the lad's education with the parish priest. And he says to the priest, and he likes to tweak the priest, likes to provoke the priest, "Well now, Abby, what if I handed the boy over to you? You would teach him that one should not steal money from people's pockets, nor lie, nor ill-treat their inferiors, because this is all against God's will and His commandments, and it leads one to hell, right? That's it, isn't it?" The priest says, "Well, there's more to it." And the grandfather breaks in, "I know that. But you would teach him not to do these things because they are sinful and offend God. However, he already knows he should not do them because they are unworthy of a gentleman and a decent man." "But, senor," says the priest, and again the grandfather breaks in, "Listen, father, that's all the difference here. I want this boy to be virtuous for the love of virtue, and honorable for the love of honor, not because he fears hell's kitchen, nor lured by the bait of heaven." That is the task I'm leaving you with. To be optimistic and be forward-looking and to be of good cheer, but most of all to be involved and to take nothing for granted, because cultural evolution may help us, but that doesn't mean we can't push it along the way. And the second task is to be gracious and to be good and to be kind, and that's what ties into what I was reading a moment ago. In short, to be the opposite of what the religious right believes about us and likes to portray us. The biggest challenge we probably face right now goes back to the steamroller that I held up earlier. These people really do believe that we cannot be good and decent and kind because we don't have a faith belief, because we don't believe in God. They are absolutely convinced that you cannot be ethical without that belief. And our challenge is to show them that they are wrong. When I leave their meetings, I'm always a little confused. A lot of thoughts racing in my mind. My long-suffering wife has to listen to me come home and just start to spill all this out. Everything I've experienced, everything I've heard, everything I've felt. And remember, I've been doing this for 25 years. We've been married for almost 21, so she's been putting up for quite a while. But when I leave, I always ask myself, if their religion is so wonderful, if it's so great, if it's so incredibly awesome, as they claim, if it has all the answers, if it makes them a better person, makes them better people, why is everybody at this meeting so damned unpleasant? That's what I think when I leave the religious right gatherings. Why is everybody so bitter? Why is everybody so angry? You know, Pope Francis said something recently. I guess it was a little bit misinterpreted about atheists and the redemption of atheists and the possibility of atheists getting into heaven. And when I read that, I was really kind of scared because you know what? I don't want to go to heaven. I've been with the people who are going to be populating heaven. I don't want to spend eternity with them. That's not heaven. That's hell. I mean, that's actually kind of in a weird sort of twisted Twilight Zone kind of way. That would be my hell, to go to heaven. So the challenge is, think back to what I read earlier from that passage from the novelist De Quietos. And we've already abandoned this sort of child's interpretation of morality. That's the thing that always strikes me about the religious right meetings I'm at. You know, I've raised 2 children with my wife, and although they're teenagers now, when they were young and we were raising them, everybody knows as a parent that children respond to some type of punishment when they're bad, although we never use corporal punishment in my home, other types of punishments, and rewards when they're good. And that's sort of how you begin to instill decency and morality. And then as they get older, it's a little more sophisticated. But a lot of people never get beyond that initial stage. And they're still always thinking that I should be good because there's a reward at the end. You know, whether it's heaven with harps and clouds or 72 perpetual virgins or whatever it is, you know. There's a reward at the end. And if you're not good, there's punishment. There's fire. There's demons poking you with those sticks. There's all kinds of bad things. Well, if the only reason you're good and decent is because you want a reward or you're fearing punishment, you have missed the whole point. And that's what I so much want to tell the religious right sometimes at these meetings, but of course, you know, I have to remain undercover. So I just sort of listen and smile. But I sometimes want to stand up and say, how dare you judge my morality when yours is based on a child's way of looking at the world? Good things if you behave, bad things if you don't. Well, we know better than that. And the challenge for you, as I wrap up, the challenge is to somehow find a way in your own unique approach to get that point across to the average American because they just aren't seeing it. There was a poll out recently, just the other day, some of you might have seen it, said that the average American believes, something like 60% believe that religion's influence on American society is on the wane. That's the good news. The bad news is something like 75% thought that was a bad thing. Because they fear that there is no ethical system to come behind it that can keep people good and keep them from being bad, even though religion's record in this area is certainly far from stellar. So, the challenge, and I'm sorry to have to, kind of begin this great meeting with a task of this size, is simply to go out and convince everybody that we can be good and decent too. No problem, right? No problem. Thank you. We have time for questions. Do we have mics in the aisles, so if we could maybe use those. I don't think your mic is on, Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Boston. I visited Washington, D.C. A couple of years ago. I went to the Smithsonian Institute, and I noticed that David Koch had contributed $35 million to build what is possibly the nicest evolution museum that I've ever been to. It's better than the one in Paris, the one in New York City, and other ones that I've gone to. And yet, the same David Koch supplies the Tea Party, who are comprised of fundamentalist Christians, as far as I know. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, do you think that the money, people with the big bucks in this country, are funding these fundamentalist religious groups to protect us from going the way Europe has gone towards more of a socialization of the major industries and a sharing of things like oil and banking?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would just back up and say, first of all, the Hall of Evolution, which you mentioned, is a really phenomenal experience. If you're ever in D.C., you should definitely check that out. But you're right. There exists in this country a collection of individuals with extremely conservative political opinions who are mainly secular. Their interest is things like low regulation, low taxation, low public services, and they're worried about the United States becoming more like some of the social welfare states of Europe. So they're very much in the mode of bootstrap capitalism. Now, there are some libertarians among our own movement who agree with them, and that's fine. These folks take an additional step in that they look at the religious right as a sort of tool that they can use, that they can get these folks to vote for extremely conservative social issues candidates who are against abortion, who oppose LGBT rights and all this sort of thing, and that they'll get a free ride on the other issues that I mentioned, the more secular ones. And for a long time, that, in fact, has been the case. I mean, if you look at a lot of the leading social conservatives in our political life right now, many of them also adopt extremely conservative economic policies and oppose any expansion of public programs and things like that. So there is an effort underway to kind of, to merge those two movements, but it's not a true merger because the secular conservative wing, represented by groups like Heritage and some of the others out there, they don't want the social conservative wing to get too much power and too much control and try to tell them what to do. And that is a struggle that's been playing out in the Republican Party now for, something like 30 or 35 years. Yes?
Just curious how you managed to attend these religious right meetings. I mean, aren't you famous enough or a known quantity enough? And on the
no, not really. I mean, I have been on the O'Reilly Factor, so one would think that would do it, but that was a few years ago. So most of the time, it's not a problem at all. And there have been times when I've run into people that I recognize, and I don't engage in any deception. If I run into people I know, I just tell them what I'm doing there. It's really an interesting way to get a good inside look at what these groups really want to do, because even though they must be aware that there are people there who don't agree with them, they're sometimes very frank about their goals and their strategies, especially their political strategies. One of the things they've been trying to do for a number of years is turn houses of worship into centers for partisan political activism, to the point where the pastor hands out material telling people which candidates they ought to vote for, which is a complete violation of federal law. And they will outlaw these strategies and they will discuss them very openly, because they assume they're talking mainly to their own kind, and it's a good way for us to get information about what they're trying to do politically. Lou?
Maybe one of their spies is in this room.
Very, very likely. So watch what you say, Lou.
It's a trade secret, I can't tell you. I'm quite confident that everybody in this room can be moral without the reward and punishment. And a lot of people who don't belong to the AHA are also good without God, even if they believe in God. But isn't it possible that there's a significant percentage of the population that really needs religion in order to be moral? And what would we do if that turned out to be a problem in our society?
There may be a percentage that feels that way, but to tell you the truth, that's always kind of scared me. To think that if somehow some earth-shattering event occurred that shook people's faith in one of the major world religions, would your neighbors suddenly feel it was all right to rob and kill and rape and murder? If that's the only thing keeping them from behaving that way, I'm not going to sleep very well at night thinking that, believing that. So I think the first step for us is to help folks understand, as I mentioned during my remarks, that it's possible. And that millions of us are living this way, and help them understand that, I'm not trying to necessarily get anybody to change their own perspective theologically. If they want to believe, that's fine, but to stop assuming that religion is the only way to guarantee morality or decent behavior. Ann?
Yes, thank you. My question is about the pending lawsuit, or that the Supreme Court has agreed that they're going to hear more about prayer in governmental meetings.
Right.
My question is for local groups who may have been struggling or have active things open or about to do something about that. Should you forget about trying to have those discussions with anyone until the results of this, or is it still worthy of a fight to have?
Good question. Let me just back up a little bit for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The Americans United filed a lawsuit some years ago in a little city outside of Rochester, New York, named Greece. And they had a practice in Greece of opening their town board meetings with what was almost always Christian prayer, like 98% Christian prayer. They only brought non-Christians in after we complained. They finally managed to find a non-Christian to open the meeting. We won that case before the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a large religious right legal group, persuaded the town board members to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which they did, and the Supreme Court has announced that it will hear the case. It will hear the case. Oral arguments will probably be in late November, early December, with a decision about this time next year. So this is going to be a major case. This is the first time the Supreme Court will have looked at the question of prayers before government meetings since 1983. The 83 case is called Marsh v. Chambers, and in that case the Supreme Court basically allowed this Nebraska state legislature to open its sessions with what were largely non-denominational prayers. But these prayers are certainly not non-denominational, so we're going to get a ruling on to what extent you can open your town board meetings with prayers that are clearly tied to Christianity. Obviously the court's very divided on these issues. Everyone's going to be looking at Justice Kennedy. He tends to be the swing voter in these cases, and it's hard to tell how it will shake out. But your question about whether it's worthwhile to continue these protests in light of that ruling, on legal ground, no, because any new lawsuits that were filed will simply be held in abeyance until the Supreme Court rules next year. But that doesn't mean you can't continue to bring the matter up on other grounds. There are non-legal arguments you can make. You can say to county and city officials, we know not everybody in this community is a Christian, and not everybody agrees with your use of prayers before meetings. Why don't you move to some type of private religious expression instead, and not proclaim that you're praying in the name of the entire community? So there are those non-legal arguments you can make. But anything legal isn't going to be persuasive right now because the court would simply say, we'll put that on hold until the Supreme Court rules. Yes?
Yes, you mentioned the tornadoes, and some Christians think this is God's punishment. Can you contrast that with the propensity of Oklahoma voters to elect United States senators who reject the idea of global warming?
Well, they also rejected the idea of government aid to people who were affected by Superstorm Sandy. So you had some folks there in office who, when someone else needed help, they couldn't be bothered. But when their own constituents were struck by the severe weather, then of course they were happy to try to get as much government aid as possible. And it does amaze me, to sort of put a larger spin on your question, how often at religious right meetings you will find people getting a pass for behaviors that liberals will be excoriated for. And example one is Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich, that great Christian statesman who's on wife number 3, who has probably had all manner of unethical dealings when he was in the House. He was reprimanded on at least one occasion. Yet Newt Gingrich is just held up as this great and wonderful person, but of course Bill Clinton was attacked for his sexual behavior, and other liberal politicians have been attacked for that. So they're quite capable of having that belief and holding a contradictory belief at the same time. Nice sleight of hand there, Herb.
Rob, I've been in some debates about can you be good without God, and the answer for a lot of these fundamentalist ministers is no, because it's not about good works, it's about belief. We're all born miserable sinners, and the only way to go to heaven is to be saved. And I wind up telling some of the Christians in the audience, look, I think you people are better people than your minister thinks you are.
Good point. And I would just say one thing about that. Americans United is a diverse collection of individuals. Many of you know Barry Lynn, who's our executive director. Well, some of you also know his title is the Reverend Barry Lynn. He is a United Church of Christ minister. And we work in D.C. with the Baptist Joint Committee, which is the moderate Baptists who are very strong in support of separation of church and state. And we work with mainline Christian denominations and Jewish organizations and Hindu groups. We're even reaching out to the moderate Muslim community. So is a lot of work to be done in the religious community among people who are very strong on our side. It's some of the fundamentalists that tend to take things to the extreme, and that is a manifestation that occurs in many different faiths. In this country, since we have a sort of Christian majority, we're most familiar with Christian fundamentalists, but obviously we've seen the results of Muslim fundamentalism, and there's even Hindu fundamentalism, and even Buddhist fundamentalism. I mean, I used to think, there can't be Buddhist fundamentalism, but actually there is. Pretty much every movement can have an extreme wing and can sort of affect the political system with its extreme views. Yes.
Rob, I'm Dawn Harris from Arkansas. I was really impressed with your view of heaven. I would like to extend it to how boring it would have to be to walk golden streets praising and singing all this time. And I would like to encourage you to promote or perhaps even write your version of heaven in a novel and have it made into a movie so that everybody could experience that.
Actually, I have a better idea, okay? Remember, there was a spate of books that came out recently where people claimed that they briefly died and went to heaven, and they wrote about what it was like. Well, I was raised Catholic. We discarded that religion around 17, but Catholics had this sort of quasi-belief in limbo. Nobody was ever really clear what exactly limbo was, but when I was in Catholic school, we were told that limbo was a place where babies went if they died before they got baptized. So I'm going to say I died and briefly went to limbo, and every chapter is going to be not much going on here. Yes.
Hi, Rob. Given that religious extremists have been so successful in inserting their initiatives into government institutions by construing religious activity as free speech,
Right.
Where do you go from there? I mean, is the best way to counter that to try to, put teeth back into the Establishment Clause, push for equal access? Say if religion is just speech, it should be governed by the same policy restrictions as other forms of speech. It should be governed by the same kind of tax codes as other forms of speech. Would you advocate overall a kind of varied approach depending on the circumstance? I mean, what is your...
Well, the first thing we have to do is recognize what some of the conservative religious groups are asking for, and it's not equal access, it's privilege. That's the first step. They want their churches to be able to jump headfirst into politics, tell people how to vote, yet a secular nonprofit that did that would be sanctioned by the IRS. So what they're seeking is actually, preferential treatment. That's the first thing. Recognize it, label it as such. The second thing, I think, is one thing you mentioned was trying to get teeth back into the Establishment Clause. And the Establishment Clause is that part of the First Amendment which says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And the Establishment Clause has been substantially weakened by the Supreme Court over the years. But as I mentioned during my remarks, it's just one vote. One conservative justice retiring from the Supreme Court and being replaced with a justice who's more separationist, more progressive in views, could change a lot of things. So be thinking about that in the years to come, because obviously we're looking at some possible changes on the Supreme Court due to the ages of some of the justices. An individual sitting in the White House in 2016 and beyond, whoever that may be, is probably going to be well positioned to make some serious changes on the composition of the Supreme Court. And a more separationist Supreme Court could easily get the Establishment Clause back to its original understanding, and we could start to win some of the cases that we're now losing. Yes, sir.
Given your knowledge about the religious right growth, maybe you can address this question. As you know, the AHA in the Humanist Education Center has come up with what's called the 10 Commitments. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, I would urge you to read those. Now, given those 10 commitments, which are a humanistic approach to life, how can we push those on to the religious right? How do you think we can kind of let them know what we believe in as the 10 Commitments?
Well, for the short time, I think we can start to demand equal time for our statements. And some people have done that in cases where the 10 Commandments is displayed in a courthouse, for example. We won a case in Tennessee where we had an individual won the right to put up various statements supporting separation of church and state. They were quotes from the founders and so on. And he got that displayed at the courthouse right beside the 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments would be a document that we could argue, look, if you're going to say you're going to put this other document up, you need to put ours up as well. And some jurisdictions, rather than do that, will take the 10 Commandments down, but others will say, okay, we'll put your document up as well. And that, I think, is one way to go about it. Yes, sir.
It seems like we're making lots of good progress on many fronts, but fundamentally you have a group of people, which is the fundamentalists, who don't believe in democracy.
Yeah.
It's really an essential aspect of fundamentalist beliefs that they think God told them what's right and wrong, and it doesn't matter what the democratic principles are. How do you incorporate a group like that into our society in the long term? You can't just disenfranchise them, and yet it's an ongoing danger. By the way, I'm Craig James. Sorry.
Thank you, Craig. Well, that is a very difficult question without an easy answer, because you're right. You're talking about a collection of individuals who believe not in democracy, not in Republican government, but in a sort of theocratic state of one type or another. Some openly embrace that idea. I mean, there's on the far fringes of the religious right, there are the Reconstructionists, Christian Reconstructionist groups, who believe that society should be based on a legal reading of the Old Testament's legal books, Leviticus and so on. And that would be kind of a scary place to live. But they have the right to be involved in politics. They have the right to vote. The answer is not to deny them any of their rights, but to outmaneuver them politically. I mean, the ideas that I used to hear discussed during religious right meetings, especially during the 1990s, when Pat Robertson's group was the prominent group in the country, the Christian Coalition. What they were telling people to do in a largely pre-internet age, the type of organizing they were telling people to do was nothing new. It was, in fact, ripped from the left in the 60s. How to organize people, how to get them to the polls, how to make sure they vote the way you want them to. So the ideas they were using were nothing new, and we can get them back, and we can use them too. And I think actually that's what's been happening in some of the more recent elections. People talked about, in 2008 and 2012, about the Obama team having a ground game. Well, a ground game is just getting people out to vote and getting them to the polls. And it makes, as you can see from the results of those elections, it makes a substantial difference. Yes.
I found something on the internet, and I like it so much I use it as a tagline under a lot of my emails. Mm-hmm. It's anonymous, and I'm hoping somebody here knows who said it. I printed it out so I would remember it. It's, you don't need religion to have morals. If you can't determine right from wrong, then you lack empathy, not religion. And it's an anonymous thing, came out with all sorts of symbols, very nice, but I don't know.
Anybody recognize that?
Does anybody know?
I don't know that one.
Well, I have, and I'm not finding it, but I hope
it's a good sentiment.
Among somebody here might have said it. Yeah. Raise your hand. The other thing is, I would just say the power of one vote. If you can get somebody else registered to vote that thinks our way, do it.
Well, I mean, I mentioned during the 1990s, the Christian Coalition, they used to brag about how they won elections, not because people agreed with them, but because they were simply turning out more voters. In a local election, where turnout might be 20, 25%, 30%, you can see that just mobilizing a block of voters can really make a difference because the turnout is so low. Bobby, did you say?
Yes, I'm Bobby Kirkhart, and I said it. Just kidding. I didn't, but I could have. You were talking about DOMA and Proposition 8. As I read these are religion and government issues, but they're not church-state issues. It seems that more of these are coming to the fore. Many people in this room would argue that we have the same situation with our drug laws. And it seems like this is maybe the future of the battle, because the others, even though there's still a battle, the lines are very clear constitutionally. And I just would like you to comment on this. Do you see the focus changing?
I think you're exactly right. These types of issues are going to be so much more prominent in the years to come. Same-sex marriage is a perfect example. Not necessarily a traditional church-state issue, but one with extremely strong church-state overtones, to the extent that we felt that Americans United, we could address it in a legal brief by simply challenging the right wing and saying, look, what is your non-religious reason why same-sex couples can't get married? And they sputter and they try to come up with some, but they just, they'll procreation, they'll say, well, they can't have children. Well, there are people who can't have children for other reasons, and there are people who are beyond childbearing age. That's never been a necessary predicate to being married. So there are other issues like that are going to be so prominent, because once same-sex marriage is sort of the norm, and I think it will be some years in the future, other things are going to flow from that. We're seeing some of it now, where the same type of argument is going to be brought to bear. Well, the guy that owns the bakery doesn't want to make a cake for a same-sex couple, and the guy that owns the B&B doesn't want to allow a same-sex couple to stay there, and wedding photographers, and just all of this sort of thing. And people are going to be arguing, I don't have to obey the law because of my religious beliefs, and that's where we're going to get into some of these issues I talked about and that you've raised, where religious freedom suddenly becomes this blanket excuse to just ignore any law that you don't like. And the courts are going to have to come up with some kind of a standard for determining when that goes too far. Yes?
Hi, I'm Jane Roberts. Would you comment on religious proselytizing in the military? And does Americans United have any cases to bring in that area?
We've been working very closely with Mikey Weinstein at the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. Now, Mikey came to us some years ago because he was concerned about this very issue. He had personal experiences with it. His son had been targeted and harassed at the Air Force Academy. And we worked with Mikey, and then one day I just said to him, look, we can't work on this full time. I mean, we're a full-service church-state separation organization. You really ought to think about starting a group that focuses just exclusively on the military because there's so much stuff here. There's so many problems. So he did. He started the group. We're working with him very closely. And rather than go into court, which probably wouldn't be terribly fruitful, what we've been doing instead, and what Mikey's been doing instead, is working through military channels to try to change policies so that, actually not even policies, practices, so that existing policies that restrict proselytism down the chain of command are enforced. Now, the religious right is really pushing back against that very aggressively. That's why some of you might have heard these claims that anyone who dares share their faith in the military is going to be court-martialed. That's the religious right's distortion of what's really happening. What we're really talking about here is proselytism and undue forms of pressure coming down the chain of command, which is already illegal in the military. I'm sorry, I forget which side I went to last, but go ahead and then we'll do you and then we'll wrap up. So last two questions. Go ahead, sir.
The gentleman who was here just previously said the problem with the religious right is that they do not believe in democracy. Well, they do believe in democracy. They have the votes, dramatically so. This makes, in my opinion, it becomes counterproductive when we even slightly overstate the damage, the power, the virulence as a group of these people who are, in some ways, people who are conservative socially, do have a vast majority, as known by votes. The recent Under God decision, if you recall, every single senator, Democrat and Republican, went out on the Congress steps to speak loudly, one nation under God. In my opinion, we have to show more understanding than they have for why they have reasons, why they feel the way they do. And it's a long battle, but making it personal and taking the worst, most exaggerated statements as exemplifying the whole movement may not be the most productive way. My name is Al Rodbell, by the way. I have a blog where I say things. You may not let me back in if you all read it, but it's there.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. You say a lot of good things. The democracy and the religious right, there are certain issues where there is sort of overwhelming support, mainly sort of the symbolic issues, affirming in God we trust on the money, affirming under God in the pledge. You'll find a lot of support for that. Where things start to break down is when we get into some of the more specific questions of social policy, and that's where I think we're seeing a change. The types of issues that are more symbolic will follow, but it's going to take a little bit longer. Yes, last question. Go ahead, sir.
Hello. My name is Fred March. I'm from Albuquerque, and you are one of my culture heroes. The reason I debated whether to come up and talk or not, because I've been teaching for the last few years, a course on humanism at the University of New Mexico's adult education program, and it continues to be in demand. The course introduces, for one thing, in its first section, a picture of you and a quote, including at least one of the things you said today. The course, the big part of the course, the major part of it, and my largest purpose in it, I call it threats to humanism, and among the biggest, well, it's threats to democracy, and threats to democracy I equate with humanism. I interpret democracy as the engine by which humanism gets implemented in the social order. The threats to democracy very prominently include a significant section on theocratic threats to democracy.
Right.
And I just want you and everyone else to know that that course is available on the AHA website in a form that I developed and then recently revised. I have a flyer outside that describes how to quickly get access to that course. And the Christian...
I think we are out of time, unfortunately.
The Christian...
So wrap up.
I'm not making a speech. The Christian right is, in fact, well, the Christian left, the part that you characterized, is also included with many pictures and many quotes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. And if anybody wants a book, I'll be outside. Thank you.